The New Orleans Saints just landed a perfect free agency addition in safety Justin Reid. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, Chase Young is going to be a lot of fun to watch in 2025 in Brandon Staley's defense. Juwan Johnson's new contract extension could be a bit of an indictment on the previous coaching staff, and we're going to kick everything off with Justin Reid, who is the perfect addition to this New Orleans Saints defense. We appreciate you very much, whether it's your first time or your next time, for being here this time, making us your first listen, and for being in every day or here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. The New Orleans Saints made the perfect addition to Brandon Staley's defense by signing safety Justin Reid, formerly of the Kansas City Chiefs. He reunites with Tyrann Mathieu, who also adjusted his contract, which could potentially lead to some savings for the New Orleans Saints. It's an incentive player percentage, like player snap percentage availability type of a contract. And so Saints have themselves a pretty nice safety tandem here, and I think that Justin Reid is the perfect addition. The Saints missed out, or lost rather, let me say it that way, lost Will Harris, who went and signed with the Washington Commanders on a one-year deal. They bring in Justin Reid pretty quickly off of that, telling you that maybe they had some things kind of already planned to potentially do that. And they even ended up winning with a couple of other teams trying to outbid the Saints. But Justin Reid decides to come back home, the Prairieville, Louisiana native, coming back to Louisiana. Why is it that I think that he's a great addition for the New Orleans Saints? Well, it comes down to smarts. It comes down to aggression. It comes down to physicality. And it comes down to the mentals. I think that, well, I guess smarts and mentals are the same thing. But I'll explain why I'm looking at those two things a little bit differently. For me, the smarts come down to his ability to communicate, right? He's a good communicator, just like Will Harris was. The physicality, he's a very good downhill thumper, secure tackler, missed only 9.8% of his tackles in his career so far, according to Pro Football Reference. When it comes to the athleticism that he brings, he's somebody that can make those plays all the way up from the third level, crashing down and getting tackles for a loss in the passing game. And some of the tape that we watched with the insiders. You can get insider film studies with the link in the description. I'll tell you more about those here in a little bit. And in the mentals comes down to his ability to read and react, right? Click and close. I need you to be able to read and recognize, know what's going on, but then translate that from your brain to your body and go and do something about it. And Justin Reid does that extremely well. There's a couple of plays that I'll highlight that we took a look at from our film study, one of which goes to a point on him being aggressive. You watch a game against the Las Vegas Raiders where he's lined up in the box and he's got to crash down to make a stop on a swing pass to the outside, kind of setting up a screen to the outside over on the defensive right. And what he does in the meanwhile is that he actually runs through and thumps a wide receiver off of his route before still being able to crash down and make that tackle for a loss right at the catch point on the screen pass. Another play, he actually comes crashing down from way away from the line of scrimmage against the Denver Broncos. He's 13, 14 yards away, playing a deeper alignment of safety, kind of lined up as a cover two safety. And it ends up being able to crash down to the opposite side of the field. Again, watching, reading, and reacting. He ends up seeing it's all man coverage across the board. He sees a receiver pop out from behind the line of scrimmage. He ends up closing in on that. Then when he sees that Bo Nix is kind of cueing that he's going to make that throw, he hits the accelerator and is able to almost beat the receiver to the catch point, ends up making the tackle there. Again, a very secure tackler. The other thing about Justin Reid that I like is the versatility, right? I had mentioned versatility, and a big reason why I like that is because we know that that's going to be a big part of the Brandon Staley scheme, right? Like when we talk about Brandon Staley's scheme, one of the things that we talk about all the time, of course, is the 3-4 defense and what that could mean, the stand-up pass rushers, the nose tackles, all those other things. But the other piece is that like you need an aggressive as well as versatile safety tandem if you can get it. And you need an aggressive and versatile defensive back. So you need a versatile and aggressive secondary as a whole. And I think that Justin Reid applies to that because the versatility that he brings is that he's also not a liability when asked to cover. This isn't a situation where he's a guy that only plays well near the line of scrimmage. You put him far away from the line of scrimmage, you have him drop back into coverage, and he's not a liability there. One of the biggest things that the New Orleans Saints struggled with in Dennis Allen's defense over the many, many years that Dennis Allen was in charge of that defense was crossing routes, right? Like every time, because they played so much of this press man stuff that, these crossing routes challenge you to be able to maintain vertically, horizontally rather. You force defensive backs and cornerbacks into trail technique to where they're following the receiver as opposed to being over the top of the receiver or something like that. And so you need strong safety play. It's going to be able to crash down and maybe take some of those crossing patterns away. There's a play against the San Francisco 49ers where Justin Reid has the deep middle. He has the deep field. He's the only one, last line of defense. And there's a receiver crossing the defensive right side of the field all the way across the middle of the field to the defensive left side. And Justin Reid dropped back, reads, sees a short route over on the right side, sees a kind of a comeback route forming or an out route kind of forming over on the left side, and he sees this receiver come crossing over the middle of the field from his right to his left, and he looks over at Brock Purdy and sees that that's where Brock Purdy is eyeing that receiver. So he's over the top in the zone while everything underneath is in man, and he ends up crashing down and beating the receiver to the catch point because of his anticipation, his smarts, his ability to read and react, and again, him not being a liability in coverage. He was the best coverage safety in terms of Pro Football Focus grade, forced incompletions, all that other stuff for the Kansas City Chiefs last season. And now the New Orleans Saints have not just him, but have Tyrann Mathieu, both of them going from, Tyrann Mathieu, of course, started in Arizona, but then went to Houston, which is where Jordan Reid started his career. And then they went from Houston to Kansas City, and then now they unite here in New Orleans. Pretty cool to see a very similar trajectory, and the Saints keep their, former Kansas City Chief, routine going, pipeline going, all those other things. And so I think that's the thing. One of the things that I like so much about Jordan Reid is that he spent so much time with Tyrann Mathieu. He took over for Tyrann Mathieu in Kansas City. They were teammates over in Houston. Tyrann Mathieu and Eric Reid, Jordan Reid's brother, played together at LSU. He's a guy that has learned from Tyrann Mathieu and now comes in and potentially ends up extending a little bit of the Tyrann Mathieu presence even beyond Tyrann Mathieu's time. Tyrann Mathieu redid his deal so he can remain in New Orleans here in 2025. We'll see if he's back in 2026. Certainly opens the door for a quick 1-year deal to get done next year. Tyrann Mathieu has said that he wants to play 2 more years in the league, he believes. And so at the level that is his standard. And then after that, now you've got a guy like Reid that has learned from Tyrann Mathieu and now will continue to learn from Tyrann Mathieu to kind of carry the mantle, and be that Louisiana presence and leader in that secondary. I love this selection. I think for this signing. I think this is major. And to get him under the projection at just 3 years, $31.5 million when the projections were like $45 million in total, 14.5 per year. Huge hometown discount, you can call it if you want to, but the Saints winning up against other teams who are interested in Justin Reid. I think he's a perfect addition to Brandon Staley's defense, who need those versatile and aggressive safeties, and Reid definitely checks those boxes. All right, coming up next, I want to take a look at Juwan Johnson's new extension because I think this New Orleans Saints coaching staff might be more confident with last year's personnel than last year's coaching staff was. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. BetterHelp therapy online has been huge for me. It's been very helpful. I've been using BetterHelp since the pandemic, 2020, and it's been kind of game-changing for me because taking care of your mental health can be a big investment, but it's just as important as taking care of your physical body, right? Like you go to the gym, you go to therapy. That's kind of the way that I look at it. But man, sometimes these therapy sessions can run you anywhere between $100 to $250 per session. That's why I love BetterHelp, because with BetterHelp, you can save up to 50% per session. And they also offer you a flat fee for weekly online therapy sessions, making professional support more accessible and affordable for everyone. Plus, it's all online, completely virtual, suited to your schedule, video chats, phone calls, text chat. It's awesome. So go and check them out today because your well-being is worth it. Visit betterhelp.com/lockedon to get 10% off of your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. All right, family. The New Orleans Saints re-signing an extension of tight end Juwan Johnson could end up being an indirect indictment of last year's coaching staff. Now, I don't think that it's this year's coaching staff casting aspersions about the previous coaching staff. This year's coaching staff ain't worried about last year's coaching staff, right? And you got a couple people on this coaching staff that are from last year's coaching staff, but everybody's looking forward. Everybody's looking towards the future. But I do think that a lot of Saints fans have had their eyebrows raised by the fact that the Saints are not going the replacement route on offense, but instead are going back to their usual roots, even when the Saints had money to spend at their peak spending days with Drew Brees in the building and all that other stuff. They never got involved in the negotiating period very often. They didn't get involved in replacing players. They always focused on retention first and then adding talent. And I think that's what you're going to see from New Orleans this offseason. I think you're going to see more replacing or more departures next year than you'll see this year. It's just part of the salary cap management situation. Because in some cases, keeping players is better financially for you. Chase Young, Juwan Johnson's another one of those examples, than it is to let them walk out of the door. But I think that the 3-year extension, 10 years per for Juwan Johnson, is one that raised some eyebrows. Because look, Juwan Johnson had career highs in receptions and receiving yards last year, 548 receiving yards, though not enough to really, that typically warrants a $10 million per year contract for a tight end. But I don't think the Saints are paying him for what he did before. I think the Saints coaching staff right now is saying, we want to pay him, and probably Derek Carr likes him and the front office likes him and all these other things. But I think what the Saints are saying right now is that they're paying him for what he's about to do, what they believe he's about to do, we'll see, versus what it is that he has done in the past. So much like the Chase Young deal, production is going to determine whether or not this contract is a success or otherwise. It's effectively a 2-year deal. $21 million, just over $20 million guaranteed, $11 million signing bonus. The additional $10 million is paid out in the first 2 years, basically, in terms of base salary. And so it's a 2-year deal. Now, if the contract gets restructured next year, it becomes a 3-year deal. And with a $9 million base salary next season, that feels likely to happen as long as things are moving in the right direction. But what I think this is telling you is that Kellen Moore, Derek Carr, the New Orleans Saints offensive coaching staff, all that, do feel that they're going to get that level of production out of Juwan Johnson, despite previous coaching staffs not necessarily getting that level of production consistently. We've seen Juwan Johnson be somebody that it feels like the team finds out about partway through the season almost. But if they can get consistent 1 through 17, week 1 through 18, 15 games during that time is typically what I expect an NFL player to play over a 17-game season, to call it healthy, right? If they can get consistent production out of him, then this contract is worth it. If not, then the contract ends up being one that comes in to where you overpaid for the value that you got. And that very well can happen. But I think what the Saints are saying is that they believe they can get better and more production by utilizing Juwan Johnson more consistently in the offense and utilizing him in a way that plays to his strengths. And if that's the case, I think the Saints believe that about more than just Juwan Johnson. Restructuring Derek Carr keeps him in New Orleans for another year. Juwan Johnson's extension keeps him in New Orleans for at least 2 more years, even though it's a 3-year deal. We could say at least 2 more years. Chris Olave's back here in 2025. They'll probably pick up his 5th-year option. And even if they don't, I expect that he'd be back on an extension. So you're looking at least 2 more years for Chris Olave. Rashid Shaheed around for at least another year. I expect that that will continue as well. Offensive line, for the most part, is built for the next couple of years, 2-3 years in some circumstances. They need a new starting left guard. They need a new offensive lineman. I'm sure that they'll sign that player to a 3, 4, 5-year deal. If they go out and sign a starter, I mean. I think what the Saints are telling you is that with a couple of additions, they can do more with this roster than what the previous coaching staff was able to do. And that's twofold. Some of it is consistency of production. The other part of it is health. So it's not just coaching staff, it's the sports science, nutrition, like all this other stuff too, right? That has to happen in terms of keeping players or keep getting players in a situation in which these guys are healthy, right? For a full season, or as much of a season as they can be healthy for, right? The healthy is relative in the NFL. The guys are not healthy week 2 the way that they're healthy before week 1. There's no doubt about that. And so I think that if that ends up being the case, that this New Orleans Saints coaching staff, which has been the big change for New Orleans, and the roster is kind of getting additions, especially on the offensive side, right? Over on the defensive side, we've seen some change. On the offensive side, we've seen nothing but a focus on retention thus far, and no new faces yet. The only cast off really being running back Jamal Williams. Outside of that, everybody's basically back in New Orleans. And so with that being the case, I think what that tells you is that this coaching staff believes they can get better play from these players in their system moving forward. And then the additional line to that, that is more of what we read versus what they're saying, is that they can get better production out of this offense than the previous coaching staffs got out of this offense. If they're right, then great. If they're not, then, 2025 is kind of a free year for Kellen Moore. He didn't get to pick his quarterback. He came in believing that Derek Carr was going to be the quarterback, and Derek Carr is the quarterback. He'll get to handpick his quarterback in a future year. But I think if Kellen Moore and his offensive coaching staff goes out there and is able to get great production from these players, you got to look back at Clint Kubiak. You got to look back at Pete Carmichael. You got to look back at the previous coaching staffs and go, what did you miss? What happened? What are these guys doing differently? And is it really just as simple as Kellen Moore's offensive system is based off of what the players do well? Clint Kubiak and the offensive system previously needed the players to do well the things that were already in the system. You get what I'm saying? While Kellen Moore's is built off of what they do well, you needed to perform well at what Kellen Moore's system was, what Pete Carmichael was trying to do with the Sean Payton system. They weren't catering necessarily the offense, it sounds like, on a weekly basis at least, to what the defense across from them was trying to do, was ready to do, and was actively doing. And on top of that, playing these players to their absolute strengths. Finding out what is your elite trait? What is your elite trait, and what do I do to put you in position to use that? Not the other stuff. What do I do to put you in position to use that? How do I create the counter punches and stuff like that to give you some flexibility, some space, all that other stuff? Yes. But what do I do to put the ball in your hand based on what it is that you do incredibly well? What is your superpower? And I think Kellen Moore is signaling that he can feel what the superpowers are for this team. And ideally, he's going to be able to not just lean into them, but create success with them. And it's going to raise a lot of questions about what went wrong before. I don't think that the extension to Juwan Johnson finishes the Saints' investments at tight end. They did indicate during our conversation with them at the Combine that they would like to address that position more than once. So that could mean still drafting a tight end. It could mean adding a new name in free agency, but the free agency class isn't great. So the draft makes a lot more sense. And I don't think that it precludes the Saints from going after Tyler Warren in the first round if they want to either. Because I don't think that you're drafting Tyler Warren because there's a, quote, need at tight end. You're drafting Tyler Warren because you want Tyler Warren in your offense. You know what I mean? Tyler Warren is not a draft for need pick. Tyler Warren is a draft because he's friggin' Tyler Warren pick. Now, I still think Jahdae Barron is becoming more and more likely for the Saints, the corner out of Texas, and I would not be mad at that at all at 9. But I don't think that this extension of Juwan Johnson precludes them from continuing to add talent at the position, especially because ignoring that would be focusing too much on 2025. Some of the players that are in your building will not be in your building in 2026. So how do you get ready for that? Draft class. That's a great way to do that. All right, coming up next, the New Orleans Saints' new defensive system is going to make Chase Young a lot of fun to watch in 2025. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. March Madness is here, and FanDuel is making sure you can get in on all of the action in a lot of different ways, actually. And they are doing it like never before. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets by simply winning your first $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets you can spend on anything from buzzer beaters, Cinderella stories, and even who's cutting down the net. One of my favorite ways to apply your first $5 as a new customer is to go and take the money line on a heavy favorite. So tonight in the NBA, the Memphis Grizzlies, 12-point favorites over the Utah Jazz. I feel like I'm the Saints podcaster that beats up on the Utah Jazz the most, but let's be real, they deserve it. Go and put your $5 down on the Memphis Grizzlies on the money line as heavy favorites. If they win, you get those $200 in bonus bets, and then bang, you're off and running. So visit FanDuel.com today to get started. Get in on all of the college hoops action all tournament long. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Chase Young. Oh man, Chase Young should be a lot of fun to watch in 2025. The re-signing of Chase Young, 3 years, $51 million, can go up to $57 million with incentives. That deal brought me back to when the Saints first signed Chase Young last offseason. Actually, it was before they signed Chase Young last offseason when I was talking about how, I don't know that the Saints would be interested in him. And one of the reasons why I thought that the Saints wouldn't be interested in him last year is because Dennis Allen's defense was not about the speed rusher. It was about speed to power conversion. And it was about being big and long and strong and physical and all these other things, and kind of being that second, third, fourth effort guy because you getting to the quarterback when the coverage is holding up, not necessarily winning with bend and winning with speed. That wasn't the way that the Saints typically invested in edge rushers. Now, I was wrong. They ended up signing Chase Young. And as I go back and I watch the tape, and we did our insider film study breakdown, which I promise I'll tell you more about here in a second, what I found was that, man, when he had the opportunity to rush with speed, he was a different dude. He was a demon off the edge. Now, look, he was really good off the edge last year. I know only 5.5 sacks, but 73 total pressures. I think the sack number's got to come up with this new contract. But in terms of what you were looking to get from him last year, I don't know that anybody expected him to be a double-digit sack guy last season, but to be number 6 in the NFL in total pressures, I think that's pretty solid too, in addition, right? But I think you still want to get that sack number up, and I think there's a chance that that happens here in Brandon Staley's defense, because Brandon Staley's defense will elevate Chase Young as a speed pass rusher, especially in those 3 odd man front sets that allow him to be one of 5 on the defensive line on the outside in a stand-up spot. As we watched throughout the film study, what we saw is his ability to win with athleticism, to either be the guy that wins around the edge because of his simple speed, swim moves towards the inside, winning towards the inside shoulder, ended up being able to rip and duck underneath Jake Matthews on his way to a sack fumble caused on Kirk Cousins by winning on the outside. There was even one point at which he applied a pressure through Jake Matthews because he does have a little bit of that bull rush ability, to where he set up with an armbar towards his left side, showing that he was going to rush towards the outside. But instead of trying to go around Jake Matthews, he went into the body of Jake Matthews and literally walked Jake Matthews backwards into Kirk Cousins as he tried to throw a football that went incomplete over the middle in the red zone. Those are the difference-making plays that he was making as a stand-up pass rusher. I don't think that he was necessarily bad with his hand in the dirt, but boy, you can really see the special nature of what it is that he brings when he's allowed to rush from that stand-up position and get athletic quickly, right? And so I highlight that it's not just the speed. It's the aggression that he brings. It's the athleticism that he brings. And that's something that this Brandon Staley pass rush, this Brandon Staley defensive front should allow him to be able to maximize. Think about it this way. A lot of times when the Saints were having Chase Young rush as a stand-up edge rusher over on the side, it was a 4-man front. So he was lined up outside the tackle. Usually over on the opposite side, Carl Granderson was also either a hand in the dirt wide 9 or he was a stand-up. And when we say wide 9, we mean not just outside the tackle, but sometimes even outside of where they would be a tight end. So all the way to the outside most gap in those situations. That left 2 players that were immediately over the offensive line. This might seem trivial, but imagine that same thing, but instead of 2 players over the offensive line, 3 players over the offensive line. Why is that important? Because 3 players have the ability to take up and occupy 4 offensive linemen. If you've got 5 that are sending pressure, so you have the 2 outside rushers, and then you have those 3 on the defensive line that are rushing, and those 3 on the defensive line take up 4 offensive linemen, somebody's got a one-on-one, and somebody's matched up either with a tight end, an extra protector out of the backfield, or is getting a free run. That's one very simplified idea. The other reality is that you have that same setup, but one of those outside rushers doesn't actually rush the passer. They drop back in the coverage, or they do a hook zone, they cover in the flat zone, something like that. In that case, still, if 3 of those off defensive linemen are taking up 4 of the offensive linemen, that's a one-on-one for that stand-up edge rusher. And when Chase Young got one-on-ones as a stand-up edge rusher, he tended to win last year. And that was in a system that didn't necessarily ask him to do that outside of, I want to be careful about how I say this, because he wasn't strictly limited to only being a stand-up pass rusher in obvious passing situations, but you saw that when those opportunities presented themselves, while Dennis Allen was the head coach, that his stand-up-edness increased, right? And so that's all that I mean to say. It wasn't that he only ever stood up in obvious passing downs, 3rd and long, when the team was playing up against the Carolina Panthers and they were up 30, he stood up a lot in those situations because it was all passing situations, right? So I think that with a Chase Young, what you're getting in that extension is kind of like we just talked about with Juwan Johnson. That the team saw what he did last year, saw all that on tape, these new coaches, the edges coach and Jay Rodgers, the defensive line coach and Bo Davis, the defensive coordinator and Brandon Staley, right? You have all those people that are watching this player and they're going, yeah, I can work with that, right? And they feel really good about what they can do with it. How do you know they can feel really good about it? 3 years, up to $57 million in terms of the contract. That's a pretty sizable deal. It's one of the largest deals the New Orleans Saints have given out. Like if he were a first-time signee, it's a little bit different because he's re-signing. But if he were a first-time signee, that's like the 3rd richest contract the Saints would have given to somebody that is signing for the first time, right? I'm caveating a lot when I say that, but like it's a sizable deal for New Orleans, not for a typical extension for them. They've done $100 million extensions for Drew Brees and Michael Thomas and all this other stuff. But like if it were a new deal, pretty sizable in terms of what it is they do. And you got to kind of think about it like a new deal because it's a new coaching staff making that decision. Now, you save a little bit of money because if his base salary and signing bonus prorate and previous prorates all come together and total less than $9 million, you're actually saving money in 2025 by signing him, right? But we don't know what that exact annual breakdown is. We know that it's about $17 million per year with the potential to be $19 million per year in terms of overall average, but we don't actually know the annual breakdown, base salary, signing bonus, all this sort of stuff. So we'll break all that down in another episode. But I just think that like Chase Young, if nothing else, has a lot of potential to be a lot of fun to watch here in 2025 and potentially see that sack number tick up. Now, is that going to help the Saints win games? No, they got to do other stuff to win games, right? It can't just be Chase Young getting 5 more sacks than he did last year. But getting those 5 more sacks certainly helps. All right, coming up in tomorrow's episode, let's see what happens, what's official, what's unofficial after free agency officially kicks off later on today. We appreciate you very much. As always, make this your first listen. Go and check out Locked On NFL Draft for your second listen today. We appreciate you very much making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me on the show. As always, if you see me, please say hi. If you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.